Let's get started. What comes to your mind when I say disaster? Some of these? Well, these are the natural disaster. But when we look from a technology perspective, disasters can come in any form, like the natural disasters, equipment failures, power outages, cyber attacks, and many more. Disaster is a nightmare for any IT organization, as the average cost of enterprise IoT downtime is estimated to be close to $5,600 per minute. It is important to have a disaster recovery plan in place. What is disaster recovery? Disaster recovery is the organized to recover from IT after the disaster that affects the business operations. This disaster recovery can be considered as a subset of business continuity. Consider a scenario where all your IT infrastructure, including the production and backup server, is created in the local premise. The data and business applications are therefore hosted on the local server. What will happen if the entire area gets affected by a like an earthquake or a ransomware attack? What is your plan to protect the critical business data then? Disaster recovery comes into crucial times. Disaster recovery is the process of keeping the business running even when your local premise is hit by a disaster. How does disaster recovery work? The workload from local IT is replicated, not a backup, to offsite server locations, which acts as a secondary IT infrastructure for your application. When I say the replication, it means that the entire business process, data, and application is mirrored to the redundant server in real time. Whereas during the backup, the data is stored in redundant server only at a particular time. When you are affected by a disaster, access of your local IT infra is shifted to the remote DI. This process is called failover, and the offsite location is called the failover site. Hence, you can keep your work going on amidst the disaster from the failover site with minimal downtime, minimal or no downtime. There may be a little slowness in the access. When the after effects of the disaster have been dealt with and your local IT comes into a normal working state, the access can be restored with a process called the failback. So let's look into what a disaster recovery as a service looks like. So disaster recovery as a service is a cloud computing model that allows an organization to take the backups of its data and IT infrastructure in a third-party computing environment and provide all the DR orchestration. Also, it is also a SaaS solution to regain the access and functionality to the IT infrastructure after a disaster. DRaaS market is expected to raise to 12.54 billion by 2022. So see here the working of the DRaaS. With DRaaS, an organization physical server or virtual machines are replicated to the cloud. The service provider that hosts the infrastructure using public or a private cloud. And depending on the type of design and the failover basically happens, okay, disaster. Depending on the specific type of disaster recovery as a service chosen by the customer, the provider will also be able to manage the failover process, transitioning the user from primary environment to its hosted service environment, migrating the workload back to the customer environment when the uh, local IT has come up back. So that is the failback. So let's see the difference between an on-prem and cloud disaster recovery. In on-prem, The on-site servers will allow for more control over your server. It keeps the company data private and as no third party is associated. The data is accessible without the internet. However, on on-prem DR, the disadvantages are increase capital investment. You should have all your infra in place and limited scalability with the growth of the organization. You should keep adding your infrastructure to ensure that as the organization is growing, you have sufficient investment done on the hardware. Need for the space to build and store your hardware. Additional cost for maintenance, management, and IT support. Data loss more likely to occur during disaster because it depends on how you're planning your on-prem. If it is like entirely two different location, the cost will again increase. If it is close by, then the chances of incurring the amount will be again higher. Sorry, in the chances of data impacting due to disaster will be higher. So that's the reason why disaster recovery as a service is gaining more traction. The advantage over the cloud is no on-site hardware or building cost. The scalable to the growth of the business needs. Pay only for what you use. It's easy to connect to cloud from anywhere, any device. Backing data to the cloud can happen as often as every 15 minutes. So I'm handing off to Ranjani to delve into the next topics. You, Ranjani.
Thanks, Shweta. Now that we have understood what DR is, why DR, and several details about the disaster recovery,
Shweta, the
Shweta,
One
slides are
second. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
sure, thanks. So now that we have understood what DR is and why should we have disaster recovery and some of the considerations, we should look into the actual practical considerations that we should make in choosing the disaster recovery provider and understand the actual work involved during the disaster recovery. So, how do you plan your disaster recovery is shown here. So, the first step in planning your disaster recovery is to understand the infrastructure or the applications that are running on and the software constructs involved, whatever is the compute, storage, and network requirements which are involved in the workload that you are trying to plan disaster recovery for. So that is the first step, and the next step is to conduct a business impact analysis. So when your workload is like hit by a disaster, what is the impact that you have on your business? That is something that should be made clear by the customer team or the team that is requesting disaster recovery service for. It may be a service or it may be done within the company also, so that we will see in the types of disaster recovery, but this is one consideration that has to be done, the business impact analysis. The next step is to create a disaster recovery plan based on the recovery time objective, which is the time taken to recover your application or your services, and the recovery point objective, RPO, which is nothing but the state that the workload or the application should be after recovery. So based on how much time you can take to make this recovery and what state of communication the workload should be in after your recovery, we should create a disaster recovery plan. And then after making all these things is when we approach the the cloud service provider or the disaster recovery provider. So the next step after reaching out to this disaster recovery provider is to build the disaster recovery infrastructure, and then have this plan, disaster recovery plan, noted down or documented somewhere, and then somewhere which is reachable whenever there is a disaster recovery for reference. And then we have to simulate a disaster and test whether this plan works properly. So these are the steps which are involved in planning a disaster recovery. Next slide, please. So yeah, so there are several factors that are influencing what type of disaster recovery your method falls into. Those are, of course, the budget, the time taken for recovery, and the resources or the expertise that is available within the organization or at the provider site. And then is the testing and the validation efforts. Based on these, we will split the uh, disaster recovery into three types. Next. So yeah, this slide gives you the details about the types of disaster recovery. So there are three broad types of disaster recoveries which are available currently. First is the managed disaster recovery. The second is the assisted disaster recovery, and the third is the self-service disaster recovery. So, in managed disaster recovery, once you have reached out to the provider, all the other steps are taken care by the provider, or all the functions are offloaded to the provider, and provider does the complete recovery of your workloads when a disaster occurs. So, as everything is done by the provider, this is a bit expensive way of disaster recovery, but it gives guaranteed results because a third party is providing you this service, and it is platform agnostic. It doesn't depend upon the platform or the infrastructure that you have actually hosted your infrastructure, your applications on. So, this provider may provide to many such customers. So this is platform agnostic. So the second type of disaster recovery is assisted disaster recovery. Say, consider the cases where you will use considering the cases where you will use it. Think of a highly customized applications that would have some unique needs which may not be feasible to be explained to the service provider. In such cases, we may need to have some expertise within the customer organization, and some of the tasks that can be offloaded to the provider or the disaster recovery provider. So that is where we will use some this assisted kind of disaster recovery. As we see, it is there may be consultations provided by the provider or the disaster recovery provider on optimizing the disaster recovery procedures. This is a bit less expensive than the managed disaster recovery, where everything is handled by the provider, as some of the work is only offloaded to the provider and some is still being done from the customer side. So in this case, in case of assisted, customer has some control over what testing can be performed and how the integration and validation can be performed. And providers can supply additional resources during the testing. So this is one type, and the next type is the self-service disaster recovery, where we have the expertise within the organization, and disaster recovery is performed from within the organization. So there is in-house expertise and program management capabilities, which is already in place to plan this disaster recovery, execute, and deploy all the recovery sites and stuff. So we have resources, we have expertise, and we have the plan to execute the recovery. So that is where we will use this self-service disaster recovery, which is obviously the least expensive, and these results are not based on the provider, and so this is based on the internal expertise, and this can be adjusted based on the RTO and RPO that I defined. Like, what is the duration where recovery can happen, and what is the point or the state of the state of the workloads when this disaster recovery happens and they are back online. Next slide. So that was on the types of disaster recovery that we have seen, and there is also services, there is also other considerations and a set of valid questions that should be asked before selecting your disaster recovery providers. So, disaster recovery can services may range from simple data recovery for administrators and selective recovery from within the service provider's data center itself, or it may be a virtual machine mounting where physical to VM conversion should happen within the service provider's data center for temporary application availability, or it may be a full DR, which is happening at the provider's data center, including services such as VM mounting, VPN rerouting, domain name resolution updating, or virtual desktop infrastructure access to the customers of the organization which is seeking this disaster recovery, and some physical access for administrators too. So we should not assume that a service provider offering DRAS will cover all the disasters and deliver all possible services. It depends on the requirement of the organization. So, what the requirements of the organization are? Does it require a zero downtime and zero loss of data, or is there any defined period of downtime and some loss of data acceptable? And how does this requirement vary by application, workload, and so on? And what type of disaster we are protecting against? Is it only hardware failures? Does it even cover human errors, malware, and natural disasters, etc.? And what is the budget? As you see, the number of additional services we are looking for, your budget will increase. And if your recovery point is it is only the 10 percentage, last 10 percentage of the recovery point that will decide what your cost is. Initial 90 percentage will be covered generally, and what the last 10 percentage will add humongously to the cost. So all these things should be defined. So some of the questions that we put forward are depending on the provider resources. What is the number of customers that can be supported by the providers with the resources they have? How many concurrent failures they can support? And what happens if the disaster recovery service cannot be provided by the provider during a disaster? There can be cases when there are a lot of customers in a specific region, and so if disaster happens in that region, the provider may overshoot with the disaster recovery requests, and they may not be able to provide recovery services also. So all those things should be defined, and first of all we should understand how do we declare a disaster, what are the set of conditions that we have agreed upon to accept that there has been a disaster. So the next slide please. The next consideration is what access will be available to the end users or the customers using these workloads or applications. So how will the customers and the internal administrators have access? So for internal administrators, will there be access to applications? Will the VPNs be managed or rerouted? Are some of the questions. And for the end users or the customers, will there be access for VDA users, the virtual desktop users, and how will the access be provided for outward facing applications? Will the DNS be updated, or how will the necessary access be provided to the administrators? All these are some of the key considerations when considering end user access. Next slide, please. So, what type of assistance will be provided by the service providers? These are the standard processes and assistance that are defined by the service providers. It should be known by the customers. And what is the procedure for failback? Once the disaster recovery is handled and the site is back up, the customer site is back up, how do we fail over and fail back? Those are some of the things that we should describe, and the services, professional services, or the experience that is available at the provider site. and what support will they provide for internal testing are some of the things that we should have as a key consideration. Is the screen share still available?
No, I
I
think it's
seem
not.
to, yeah. Shweta, I think you should reshare the presentation.
Yeah, you have stopped the presentation, Shweta.
So while she presents, these are the kind of provider assistance that we get from the provider level. The last consideration is the cost. That is something that would be a major consideration for small organizations, and something that bigger organizations can take more risks in, or they have a generous way of spending there. So cost is also some major factor. I think the last slide. Next, yeah. Thanks. So there will be a list of services that are provided basically, which will cost less, and the additional services which will add up to a lot of cost. So all these cost-related queries should be made in the beginning itself. So there can be a la carte, or there can be bundled or upfront pricing for these recovery. So those should also be made clear before the disaster recovery itself, and during the planning. And there may be a mix of upfront and recovery costs, that is also possible. So these are some of the considerations, like what is the resources available at the provider end, what is the access that will be available for the end users, assistance provided, and the costing. So I finish my part with the key considerations and hand it over to Ramya.
Yeah. Yeah, Shweta. Just keep it there. Yeah. So lately, we have seen a lot of enterprises have started evaluating the disaster recovery options on the public cloud. To name a few: AWS, Microsoft, Azure, Google Cloud Platform, and others. So, why is this sudden adoption? The sudden adoption of public cloud resources is because of the migration of employees to the remote workspace, given the current pandemic situation. So the biggest benefit of using DRaaS in public cloud is the public cloud infrastructure as a service. Why so? Because the infrastructure as a service cuts down the cost of the standby hardwares, as mentioned by Shweta, by replacing them with the on-demand cloud resources. So this basically implies that DRaaS has the foundation on cloud infrastructure. So that is an interesting point to note when DRaaS is having a lot of benefits in the cloud infrastructure. So Shweta, next one. So let us see how DRaaS is offered by few of the well-known cloud service providers. So this slide shows some of the few known cloud service providers in the industry. So next one, Shweta. So first, let us look at AWS. So Amazon Web Services. So Amazon Web Services cloud-based disaster recovery and workload migration offerings are provided through the Cloud Endura DRS. So this was acquired some time back, and their integration with AWS kind of provided the DRS services in AWS. So this Cloud Endura DRS can replicate the workloads from on-premise or any other infrastructure as a service environment to AWS, or it can even do it between AWS regions. So it has the flexibility of both replicating from on-prem or from other infrastructure as a service to AWS, or even across AWS. So this is the brief architectural view of how exactly the Cloud Endura DRaaS is provided in AWS, which has the primary site and then it has the secondary failover site. So next one, Shweta. So then why do we have to use AWS DRS, right? So there are a couple of interesting advantages that one needs to consider, like some of the key consideration how Ranjani mentioned, right? So one of them is the continuous data replication. So the continuous data replication always has a low cost because it uses enough AWS compute and enough AWS storage resources to support the data replication only on demand basis. And the second important point to notice is the automated machine conversions from any native pawn to the supported AWS instance and images. So it does complete automatic conversions between them. And another important thing is it supports the popular enterprise softwares, operating systems, cloud environments, including Azure, GCP, IBM Cloud, Oracle, to name a few, and VMware too. So, and another very important point is the point in time recovery. That is the ability to recover either the most current application state or some of the prior time application state, and a non-disruptive DR testing. So how Ranjani mentioned, the point in time recovery is a very important crucial criteria in DRS, right? So that is pretty well covered in the AWS DRS. So all of these kind of gives you a gist of what are the key points that you should consider if you are going to use AWS DRS. So Shwetha, next one. So next, let's look at Azure. So Azure Site Recovery offers the DRAS service. So it is known as Azure Site Recovery. So that is the feature that provides you this offering. So it has provided this offering through an acquisition it has done way back in 2014. So this service is used to protect the physical as well as the virtual Windows or the Linux workloads outside of its primary data center, and it's a traditional on-premise backup services. So the emphasis here is given on protection for these workloads. So what exactly happens during this Azure site recovery setup process is that you can either choose Azure or any other data center for the replication target. So you're given that flexibility over here. Then in the case of an disaster, like how Shwetha mentioned, disaster can occur in any form, right? In any case of those disaster, your apps can still continue to operate in the Azure cloud with a very minimal downtime. So it should be very measurable and minimal. So that is a good point to note here. So then the Azure Site Recovery also supports the cloud failover of both the VMware and Hyper-V virtual infrastructure. So it supports the virtualization failover as well, not only restricted to VMware, but also provided to the Hyper-V. So good point to note in Azure. Moving on, Shwetha. Yeah. So as I mentioned, right, so when I say that it protects both physical and virtual Windows outside of the primary data center and traditional on-premise backup systems, right? What are the additional services that it provides? Because protection is something that DRS is meant to be, right? So some of the additional key factors to note are it does an on-demand creation of VM instances during the recovery incidents. So everything is done on demand basis. It's not pre-configured as you would do it in an hardware kind of DRAS environment in an on-prem. So, and another thing to note is it provides a non-disruptive DR testing kind of a scoping environment for you. And the other thing is that the targets can be customized when you have to do a recovery environment setup for you. You can customize the target objectives, and you can even customize the recovery time objectives. So there is a lot of flexibility given to the user to customize these. Along with that, the customer can also customize the recovery plans in the form of a run books. So, and these run books can be leveraged using the Azure automation over the PowerShell scripts. So you can have a set of commands put into this runbooks using the Azure automation feature that is provided, or using the PowerShell scripts. So this kind of makes the complex scenarios very simple for us to do in terms of automated environment. So that those are the key highlights that you can note in the Azure DRAS services. Yeah, moving on, Shwetha. So let us see next about GCP, the Google Cloud Platform. So one of the key points to note in GCP is that the Google Cloud does not offer a packaged DRAS as like Azure or AWS, But however, the important point to note here is that it provides documentation on the cloud-based disaster recovery planning and how to use the existing GCP services as a DRAS platform. So it provides all the resources that is required over there. So it also offers many products that can be used as a building block when you're creating a secure and reliable DR plan. So this is more like a do-it-yourself DR plan, right? Like how Ranjani was telling in the different types of DRAS of offerings provided by the companies, right? So some of the building blocks that GCP provides to build your own DRAS plans are cloud DNS, cloud storage, and the compute engine. So, and along with this, the other important thing that GCP offers is that it has a strong partnership with various companies like Veeam, Actifio, and Zerno that offer disaster recovery capabilities on GCP. So they have a very good tie-up, and you can choose from any one of those offerings as well. Shwetha, next one. So having said this, what are the key consideration? Why do you have to go for the GCP kind of a DRAS environment, right? So as I said, GCP services are very useful if you want to do a do-it-yourself kind of a DRAS process, right? So when you do that, do it kind of your DRAS process, what are the services that you get? So the three important services that you can think of is the cloud monitoring, cloud status dashboard. So what it does is it helps you to do the application monitoring, the metrics evaluation, the events assessment. And another thing is the cloud deployment manager. So what it does, it automatically creates the GCP environment for the predefined templates that you have mentioned in your runbooks. And the third part is the third-party infrastructure templating. So as I mentioned, they have a good tie-ups with other firms, right, who provide the DRAS services. So it provides a third-party infrastructure templating using them and configuring management softwares with GCP supports that are available. Like you have Chef, you have Terraform, you have Ansible. So using the existing GCP services in collaboration with the other offerings, you can get a full-fledged benefit of your DRAS environment, right? So that is the key pointers that you can consider if you're choosing for the GCP DRAS. Next one. So let's see about VMware now. So VMware provides the DRAS through the acquisition of Datrium, which was done recently. So it provides a easy to use cloud-based solution that kind of combines the two important critical things, that is the efficient cloud storage with a simple SaaS-based kind of a management for efficient IT resilient at scale. So the benefits that one can see if one opts for VMware DRAS is that the consistency and the familiarity with VMware products across production and DR sites, because it's been a pioneer in the virtualization platform for quite some time. So people are very familiar with those products. And the second thing is a pay when you need failover capability model is provided. So only when you need it, you kind of pay for that. And the third thing is there is this instant power on capabilities for the faster recovery. So automatically things are handled in terms of powering on the virtual machines. So this is a brief infrastructure of how the VMware DRAS looks in terms of the SDDC cluster, the on-premise data stores, using the cloud-based services in between. So it shows the complete picture of the production side and the failover side. Next one, Shwetha. So as I spoke about all the other offerings, here also we'll look at why VMware. So what are the key points in VMware DRAS? Why would I go for it? So the first thing that I mentioned is the on-demand. So as I mentioned, there is an instant power on without the need for the VM conversions. So what does this do basically? So because there is an instant operation involved, there is a faster recovery. So the downtime is very minimalistic. The second thing is the easy to use. Because folks are aware about the VMware products, there is a kind of a consistency and continuum involved over there. So that kind of makes the product easy to use. And also along with that, there is a continuous health checks which is being done. and there is an automated audit reports which the admin can review and kind of assess the status of the environment. So that also is a very good pointer to note here. And the third one is the cloud economics. So what exactly is that? So it kind of provides the cost effective cloud storage with pay when capacity model. So you pay only when you kind of need a specific amount of storage or compute from the cloud. So what I would say is that along with VMware DRAS, VMware has a couple of other offerings which you can kind of collaborate together to have a better DRAS service. So to name them is the VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery, VMware Site Recovery, VMware Site Recovery Manager. So these are the multiple offerings that VMware provides in terms of the DRAS platform. So the organization can either use them as silos or they can combine them together to have a better recovery in terms of the disaster events. So having said all this, right, these are the few forefront runners in terms of DRAS. But also, if you see the latest reports of Forrester, there are some of the upcoming budding leaders in the DRAS market. To name a few are SunGard, Island, IBM, and Nscaled, Verizon, eVault, and Accident. So these are some of the few budding DRAS front-run players in this platform who are giving a, right? So the intention of kind of walking you through with some of the big offerings over here is to let you know how these offerings are provided by the key players in the cloud platform, as well as to also let you know the consideration that these are not just the folks who are offering you the DRAS services, but there are also some budding players whose DRAS services can be leveraged. So end of the day, what I'm trying to say is that whose service you use depends on the business use case that you have. So something that my business use case will require might be a VMware DRAS. The one which Shwetha or Ranjani's business case might be something different. So end of the day, as Ranjani mentioned, your key considerations are very important in order to determine what kind of DRAS you need. So for all of that, you need to understand the DRAS better, as Shwetha mentioned. So that kind of gives you a overall brief summary of why we had so many sections in our talk to make you understand the gist of DRAS. Yeah, over to Shwetha to give you a brief demo.
Thank you, Ramya. Considering the time, I'll quickly try to help folks so that they can still ensure to check out and try out the options by themselves. For this, I'm using the VMware Handson Lab. Hope you people are able to see my screen.
Yeah.
Okay. So VMware Handson Lab is a platform where anybody can go and explore the technology without having to install any kind of software in their environments. It has like hundreds of labs available. With respect to disaster recovery, there are 2 labs available. So I have chosen VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. Actually, the lab takes about 90 minutes, but I want to ensure that you people get the opportunity to learn and explore and get the hands-on. So I have done a recording of the session. As you can see, there will be mainly 2 sites, that is the protected site and the recovery site. The protected site is containing your on-prem system, on-prem data center, and we'll walk you how this works. So this is the entire recording is from the Handson Lab, and anybody can go and explore Handson Lab at free of cost 24/7. There are basically 5 modules. In the first module, the lab will be showing on how to create a protected site, download, deploy, and configure the connector appliance, and register the vCenter to the site. So I'll quickly run a couple of things considering the time. Here we are providing the configuration, information, and downloading the connector. And deploying it. Providing the compute resource, etc. for the template. and the connector has come up. Now you're attaching your vCenter to the connector. So you're registering the vCenter here, and you're providing the IP of the and you see the vCenter is registered. The next module is about creating a production group. So basically, the production group will help in creating the policies to identify which VMs you want to put under multiple VMs associated. The third module is basically about creating the disaster recovery plan. Where you define the orchestration configuration for the disaster recovery and workload mobility. So running through the how to create the plan, you're providing the information for creating the plan, like the site, groups, the data centers, vCenters. So this is a plan that we have created, and I'll be showing how it gets executed. It's about testing the DR plan, which Ranjani was mentioning, to ensure that your disaster recovery will work appropriately when in need. So that's how you try out the disaster recovery test plan. Disaster recovery plan testing will be done. And the final module where we execute the failover, how it happens. So I'm again walking through the lab. So basically, I have skipped module 2 and 4. Now we are in the final module of executing the recovery. So we are using the DR plan that we had created in the third module. It is failing over. And here you can see the relocation of the virtual machines has happened during the failover. So the failover execution has committed. And on what went during this entire process. So you can see the failover info, failover mappings with the information of all the vCenter resource which we had defined around module 1 on 1 and 3. And if at all any issues, any errors will be captured here. So this was a quick demo of how the disaster recovery as a service will work. As I mentioned, any of you, each one of you can go and try out all these things on your own through VMware Handson Lab. So this was what I had for today. Hope you enjoyed the session.
Thank you so much for such a detailed discussion on how to recover from a disaster. So thank you, audience, for listening. If you have any questions, you can drop in the chat down below, And eventually, even this recording will be available on our Women Who Code YouTube channel. So yeah, I think considering the time, we can just follow up on the chat if you have any questions. Thank you, everyone, again.
Thank you, Anu. Thanks
Thank
all
you.
for joining.
Thank you all.
Great.
Bye-bye.